Okay. Okay. So, the abstract was available ahead of time. By the way, does anybody have an idea what format they're looking at here?
I won't tell.
Well, I guess SGML.
You see the typesetting of LaTeX? That can be done in HTML these days. And yes, this is HTML. You can, the paragraphs are not right justified and there's no hyphenation. Okay. The idea, of course, is that we spend a lot of time when we write, and we want to protect the investment we make in writing our documents. So we should use the best source possible. We want those documents to be maximally useful, especially when we're in this current environment teaching online. So paper is of relative little use these days, but even when we're not confined to online teaching, at least in some countries, and we want to traffic both with paper and with online formats. We don't want to wind up doing re-edits for different presentations of our documents. And by documents, I'm including course materials, research articles, various things. So our source document should admit robust translation to whatever outputs we are interested in. Of course, it's our problem to make arrangements for translations to the formats that we want to reach. My point is that we want the source that we write to have enough power to be able to reach whatever we need to reach, or might in the future want to reach, ideally. That might not always be something we can fully anticipate. And so the idea that I've been playing with since 1998 is well, I didn't coin the term LaTeX profile in 1998, but the basic idea is to use a LaTeX profile. I talked about LaTeX profiles at TUG 2010, and there's a Tugboat article that I think is available to the world for free now. A LaTeX profile is a dialect of LaTeX with a fixed command vocabulary where all macro expansions must be effective in that vocabulary. It is a language essentially equivalent to an SGML document type with a canonical XML shadow. All of this was discussed in my talk at TUG 2010. And at TUG 2014, TUG 2010 was held in San Francisco to celebrate the, well, that's not 100,000, that's 32 written in base 2. The 32nd anniversary of TUG. I think it was the 31st annual meeting of TUG. Probably the 32nd anniversary of TeX, actually. I'm not sure whether it's was the anniversary of TeX or of TUG. And XML 2014 was held in Portland. At that meeting, I talked about the fact that the XML guise of a LaTeX profile can be styled with CSS for online presentation. This was added after I heard Ross Moore's first talk, and the remark simply is that the HTML5 coming out of a LaTeX profile, I say should be maximally accessible. That doesn't mean in a particular instance that it is maximally accessible, but it can be fairly easily made to be maximally accessible. Why SGML rather than XML? The simple answer is that SGML provides a better emulation of classical LaTeX. And The example I'm going to use for this is this simple table, 2 rows, 3 cells. The alignment argument is right, center, right. No particular reason for that choice. And it's boxed. That is, it has 3 H lines, and there are boundaries for each of the cells. And the 2 ways early on when I was developing Gelmo, that's this name here, which is my benchmark for the concept of LaTeX profile. And I wanted to make that table, I would use this style of markup, which is pretty much like an HTML table. Of course, I'm writing it in generalized LaTeX, so I'm using LaTeX-like notation. But this is the idea in generalized LaTeX is that you're actually creating an SGML document, and the SGML document has a canonical XML shadow, but this particular markup resolves pretty quickly to XML without having to observe the distinction between SGML and XML. XML, well, all right. So, but the more traditional way of creating that table is to use a LaTeX tabular environment, and this is literally the same markup. This display, think of display as being LaTeX center. And this is literally what one might use for that tabular environment, for that table as a tabular environment in LaTeX. Notice that there's no explicit introduction for the first row. I mean, the first row just appears. This double backslash can be thought of. I mean, I've always thought of it as a beginning user. I thought of this as the end of row markup, but by the way, there's no markup for the end of the last row. So actually, it's the beginning of a row. It's markup for the beginning of a row. Anyway, the XML, I could show you the SGML that it immediately resolves to, but the XML that you wind up is somewhat more complicated than the simple HTML table type XML. And the reason for this has to do with the looseness that's available with SGML compared to XML. With XML, everything has to be fully tagged. Every element needs a start tag and an end tag. With more general SGML, depending on the document type definition, some elements, and in fact, in original HTML, which was brought up as SGML, there were many elements that did not require end tags. I guess all of them. Well, for example, all right, the root element, which had the name HTML. In original HTML, the root element never required either a beginning, a start tag, nor an end tag. Many of the elements in original HTML did not require end tags. Of course, for that to work, it had to be possible to infer the end tag from context. So how is SGML looser than XML? And the fact that it is looser than XML means that we can model LaTeX more closely with, if we can use not all of SGML, but a part of SGML that is looser than XML. like XML, SGML is a grammar for markup languages. It has stricter rules. XML officially is its own thing, but a mathematician's way of saying it is that an XML document is canonically isomorphic to an SGML document. And you can think of XML as a fully faithful subcategory of SGML. XML requires less infrastructure than full SGML. An SGML document must always include or reference a formal document type definition. XML documents, on the other hand, can stand alone with and don't always need to reference a formal document type definition. For example, you can make up your own XML document type and write a style sheet to for displaying it in a web browser, and then you can serve the XML document with that style sheet linked to it using an XML link, and that'll render perfectly well in a browser. For other purposes, that might not be so great, but an XML document can stand alone. I view XML as SGML dumbed down for use across the web. What has happened is that SGML is no longer seen in public. You see SGML behind closed doors in shops, whether they're university departments or corporation projects. The OpenSP library, to my knowledge, was the most important processing tool for handling SGML from not the earliest days of SGML, but for probably certainly for the last 10 years before XML sort of took over what was happening in public. OpenSP is a C++, well, OpenSP is a C++ library for parsing and transforming SGML documents. You can, by the way, use it with XML because, as I said, XML is a subcategory of XML. So every XML document can in a canonical way be viewed as an SGML document. OpenSP was spawned from James Clark's SP. And before XML came along, James Clark's SP, in my view, was dominant for doing work with SGML. I said before, OpenSP can be used with XML documents. XML libraries, of which there are a number, can only be used with SGML documents after the SGML documents have been transformed to XML. Most SGML documents, well, yeah, most things that are that are in a technical sense SGML documents, if they correspond to what we call documents in the real world, then they can be transformed to XML documents in a canonical way. In the old days of SGML, there was something called normalization, where I don't want to say more about that. In the old days, there was something called normalization, and transforming an SGML document to an XML document is pretty much the same thing as normalization in the old days. SGML may be losing users. It's hard to know. SGML was banned for public use with the dawn of XML. So it's not seen very much in public anymore. there's a somewhat steeper learning curve with SGML. For example, typically, well, we all know that XML uses pointy brackets for markup. SGML likewise can use pointy brackets for the markup, but for example, one can also make an SGML document look like a Lisp program. I'm not going to say any more about that. But anyway, there is a sense, I mean, there's not so much publicly available new software coming out. And so there is this sense that SGML may be losing users. We don't know what happens behind closed doors. And then I say, but the things that I know that I didn't want to put in writing, there is at least some use of SGML going on behind the scenes. I think there are probably between 6 and a dozen people at this meeting that I am pretty sure were involved with SGML at one point in their careers before XML came along, and I have no idea whether they're using it anymore. What really caused me to hatch the idea for this talk, well, I use my LaTeX profiling project on an almost daily basis. And so I'm using SGML on an almost daily basis. And I'm aware of the fact, and I have been aware of this fact for a long time, that OpenSP only supports the basic multilingual plane of Unicode. So those are U values from hexadecimal U values from 0000 to FFFF. As a mathematician, this is certainly a concern for me, because there are a number of mathematical characters. For example, the so-called Blackboard bold letters. The Blackboard bold letters live at 15XXX in Unicode. Well, most of them do. That's another story. But adding full Unicode support to OpenSP might be a good master's thesis project. Of course, it's not something you would ask a master's student in mathematics to do. Those were the students that I had because I was in the math department. But anyway, I might hope that someone listening to this talk might think about and might know of a master, or in the future. Okay, I want to say also, the talk that's following me is about Pandoc. Occasionally I receive documents prepared outside of the tech community. I'm sure all of us do. And sometimes we have to deal with them and have a way of dealing with them. And in recent years, Pandoc has become something that I will haul out on such occasions. But I want to point out, Pandoc is supposed to be the Swiss Army knife of format conversions. The idea is you can transform from format A to format B without asking very many questions, just do it. It's not quite that easy, of course, but Pandoc has a central exchange format, as I understand it. I am not really very familiar with Pandoc. But as I understand it, there's a central exchange format. And for that reason, the power of one's original document, if one is using Pandoc, is limited both by one's own source format and by Pandoc's central exchange format. Whereas if one is using source that is SGML or XML and is then going to use SGML or XML transformations, the power of that source is limited only by the document type. And by power, in this context, one should understand the number of potential destination formats that are robustly reachable. That concludes my prepared remarks. What has happened to my Zoom?
You can end the share by just scrolling your mouse down.
Oh, I see.
Yes. And here we are. So there's a question on the Q&A. You can open that up.
Q&A. I get no open questions on Q&A.
Oh, no.
On chat?
So Alan's hand is raised. So let me see what if he wants to.
That is a mistake.
The mistake? Okay.
That's what he said in chat.
How would you enter question?
I had an earlier mistake, but I have a question that Ross can answer.
Okay, the talk is for Bill Hammond right now.
Uh-huh.
We'll have some opportunity to chat after.
Yes. The question that Ross can answer later is, are the various versions of PDF representable with an SGML DDT?
Well, I mean, that's for Bill too. You want to interject, Bill?
I don't know, especially when all this stuff, I'm almost totally ignorant about tagging PDFs. However, I can say something about DVI. DVI has the structure of a classical assembly language, and any classical assembly language can be uselessly represented as XML.
I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that no, I don't think you can represent PDF versions in SGML. And the reason is because although it's deprecated, you can stop and start feature assignments in PDF without regard to the boundaries of the text. And that's not allowed in SGML because you can't have overlapping tagging. But I stand to be corrected.
Well, for that matter, the full weight of HTML5 cannot be handled as either XML or SGML because HTML5 introduced this thing called the transparent content model, which I think, Peter, is what you were referring to.
Almost. I mean, HTML5 allows you to define anything anywhere. So it's basically useless as a definition format, and it is impossible to write a DTD for it. So, no, what I'm talking about is the overlap in PDF. You can stop and start anything anywhere, which you can't do in SGML or XML. But if somebody can prove me wrong on that, I'd be very happy to prove wrong. Just a feeling.
Well, isn't it the case that something like this can be modeled by making the tree much more complicated? I mean, you would need to have additional attributes to do this, but technically, I think
yes,
you can.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you pushed it to its extreme,
yeah, it would be a very horrible
would be
result.
Very, very horrible. Yeah. I can reassure William that SGML is very much alive and kicking, although it is slowly fading from the digital humanities, having been replaced by XML. But there are many, many, many documents, thousands, if not tens of thousands, written in TEI2 SGML. And they are not being maintained because they've been finished. That is, they are digital representations of an ancient document, and they have been proofread, and that's the end of it. They're not going to be updated at any point, and so they're staying in SGML. So it's very much around there, and there are still people running systems like Omnimark to convert them to HTML for the purposes of display, but the master copies are still being stored in SGML. For what it's worth.
Any more questions for Bill?
I would have one, I think.
Okay.
Frank here. Bill, I follow your work for a couple of years, I guess. I mean, I don't know when we first met, maybe 2010. But I wonder if in the sense that keeping the work relevant, you said it's not clear how many people are still using SGML. I think it is definitely vanishing in some sense. Whether the work could be or shouldn't be moved towards, maybe even if it's getting more limited, to an XML basis. In the sense that you can actually grow people being interested in what you're doing?
Let me see if I can put something on the screen for you. So I'm going to go back into share screen. Actually, I have to, this is going to take a minute because I need to make Zoom small so I can open the window that I want to show you so that I can then share that window. All right, I think I'm there now. So I'm going to make Zoom large, and I'm going to share screen. And now the screen. So can you see this terminal window that's in
Yes.
front of my screen?
Yes, we can all see.
All right, so so here we have classical LaTeX tabular, and this okay, so this is actually the SGML that by use only of syntactic translation flows from this markup. And then I showed you during my prepared talk the XML that followed from that, which is more complicated. So the question is whether you want to suggest that people writing source should abandon this kind of tabular markup, which, by the way, this is a place where LaTeX itself has markdown features. I mean, the use of ampersand and double backslash, this is markdown. So personally, I don't want to give that up. When I write something like that, or I mean, whether it's an equation array or a tabular, I like that markdown and I don't want to give that up. But if I want to model that and have something that's just a syntactic translation from the generalized LaTeX to a formal SGML, it's not going to be XML without some knowledge beyond syntax is required to get the XML.
Do I understand it correctly that you're basically saying one of the big features of, or one of the features of SGML was or is the fact that you can have incomplete tagging and those kind of things that the standard actually supports, and this is why you have this additional step to blow it up.
It's mainly for being able to omit tags. There are lots of other things in SGML that I'm not touching.
Yeah, okay, understood.
Bill, Dave Carlisle has a message on the chat. The
Pardon?
chat, the question and answer.
Oh, on the chat?
No, on the questions and answers. Q&A.
David. But would that be syntax only, David? That's, am I supposed to write an answer to this, or can I answer it this way?
Well, you can answer it live. You can talk to him. He's hearing.
Is David here? He says he can hear me. So, I mean, my idea with this project is to have everything be as modular as possible and proceed from stage to stage to stage to stage with sort of a well-defined task at each stage. And the very first stage is syntactic translation from generalized LaTeX to SGML. And I can do that. I can't do syntax only in translating from generalized LaTeX to XML unless, all right, so in the Gelmo manual, I break out something that I called regular mode and advanced mode. And actually in advanced mode, the translation is still syntactic, but it incorporates some features. For example, hyperref's href. It's a command with 2 arguments. And so a syntactic translator, in the source, I would use href, but then the 2 arguments need to have names, but hyperref doesn't give them names. So at some point, names have to be supplied, and supplying those names requires some knowledge other than syntax.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So in going from SGML to XML, I introduce some knowledge. And at various stages, I introduce more knowledge.
I'd like to ask a sort of naive question, which
Jonathan.
is, yes, I'm not sure you're the right person to answer the question, but I think it's the right occasion. How long have we been trying to solve this problem, and why is it important?
What problem?
The problem of conversion of documents from one format to another, or the interchange of documents.
Well, I could point you to a mathematical example. And the mathematical example has to do with the difference between the complex projective plane on the one hand and the Cartesian product of two complex projective lines on the other hand. And for both of these, the field of rational functions is the complex field with two transcendentals adjoined. They share, that is, these two geometric objects share the same field of rational functions. I'm talking about rational functions. So I'm talking about algebraic geometry. But there's no regular map from either to the other. So somehow to deal with both, you need to get above both. And you can construct that using blowups.
Okay.
If you do two different blowups on the complex projective, you blow up a point on the complex projective plane, that's an algebro-geometric construction, and then blow up another point, you get to something that will admit a regular map to the product of two projective lines. So think of that. That's a place where you can parameterize everything, so to speak. So for a powerful markup, you need to be able to represent everything that you might in any eventual output want to provide for.
By some strange chance, I understood all of that because I know enough algebraic geometry. But I'm not sure many other people did. Why is
So
it?
what I'm saying, you can't very well translate HTML to LaTeX, and you can't very well translate LaTeX to HTML. Although there have been some very heroic, but it's in the end it's an ill-defined problem to translate from LaTeX to HTML because there's no the domain of definition. The LaTeX command space, if you take all possible packages, you have contradictions. So you just can't take the union of the names in all possible packages as the LaTeX command space. You have to have some sane combination of packages. And there are sane combinations of packages, but the community has never settled on a definition of what the universal LaTeX command space should be. So we are where we are.
Well, maybe we could just have 3 or 4 people agreeing to work together. That might be a start.
I don't know. I doubt it.
What is it? 2 people of some nationality, 3 opinions? I'll turn off now.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill.
You're welcome.